Over the course of the next two videos, we'll wrap this course up by learning about a useful feature that will help us during look development, as well as how we can get our textures out of Mari so they can be used in another application. In this first video, we'll focus on this look development feature inside of Mari and learn how we can render out our textures right inside of Mari using the Modo renderer. All right, great. So I have my wolf body mesh selected here. Now, this is a feature that I typically will use towards the end of the texturing process. And while there are some features that are built into ZBrush in terms of rendering out your assets, there are also features inside of Mari that utilize the powerful Modo renderer to actually create high quality renders of our textured asset. And we can do that without ever leaving Mari. Let me show you how that works. So I'm going to come over here and we will open up the Modo render palette. And you can see that opened up right there. I'm going to go ahead and drag that over so we can see the entire palette. And you can see there are three different tabs here because the Modo render palette can be used for more than just rendering. We do actually have some baking features that can be utilized as well right from this palette. However, what I'm going to be doing is over here on the render palette. Now, when looking at this here, you're going to have this channel assignment down here. And I'm going to come in here and we're just going to remove these. It looks like I was playing inside this project with these prior. So the first thing you'll need to do in order to render out your Mari textures is you will need to link your Mari channels to Modo effects. Now, again, I have the body object selected, and for that particular object, we have ambient occlusion, diffuse, roughness, and specular channels. So let's go through the process of linking these up. We'll first link the diffuse. I'll link that to diffuse color. We'll come over here and grab our roughness, and I'll link that over here to rough. And lastly, we'll go ahead and grab the specular, and I believe we were using that as specular weight. I wasn't real descriptive with my channel name, but let's come over here and connect that to specular amount. Fantastic. And then I'll jump over here just to double check and look for my specular input on my shader. There we go, specular color actually. I'll just jump over here and correct that really quickly. We'll remove that link and again link our specular channel to specular color. There we go. Great. So we have all of these connections made between our Mari channels and the Modo effects. Now, when we come down here, there's a preview area here that we can actually set up an interactive preview inside this small window inside of our Modo render palette. Or if we don't want to do that and we do want to render out, say, an image to disk, maybe somewhere on our hard drive, we can actually come down here and set the render dimensions, and we can either render out an image file with this first box here, or we can actually save out an LXO file, which is a native Modo file. If we want to open this project up in maybe a locally installed version of Modo to render it out and work with it. Now this by default, let's look over here at settings. By default, we should be using the default Modo setting here for use. Now this will be rendering inside of Mari using the Modo renderer. If we do have a locally installed copy of Modo, we can actually switch this to locally installed Modo. And what that'll do is it'll actually, once we execute a render, it'll actually compile our project and send it over and rebuild it inside of a Modo scene and actually set off a render inside of Modo. Now I'm not going to do that for this particular video because that requires another piece of software that you as the viewer may not have installed. So we'll just go ahead and do this right here inside of Mari. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when you're using this, it's going to work on an object by object basis. So all of the objects that I have loaded into my objects palette, they're not going to render at once inside of my render. They're going to render based on the selection. So if I come over here and preview this, what's going to happen is we're going to see a rendered preview here of the wolf body. I'll go ahead and tap that. Now this may take a little bit of time. We are working with very high res pieces of geometry here inside of Mari. So remember, the more polygons you have, the longer typically a render will take. So while this is calculating, I'll go ahead and pause the video. All right, great. So once that render wraps up, what you should see here is a little interactive preview will start to show up inside the Modo render palette. So once this render has completed, we can start to zoom in here on our mesh, and we should see the render will eventually show the exact same view that we're looking at here on the canvas. Let me see if I can go ahead and zoom in nice and close to my werewolf here, and we should see that interactively start to show up. But you can see here, again, we are just dealing with the body mesh. He's missing his pants, and he's missing his teeth and his eyes, and the other subtools that we had brought into our Mari project as separate objects. So again, this rendering feature is actually a newer feature inside of Mari. It was introduced inside of Mari 3, and it is there and can be very helpful when you're doing a little bit of look development and trying to see exactly what your textures will look like in a rendered format. Now, ultimately, if you are rendering or you're setting your Mari project up with something like the AI standard shader, or maybe it's the V-Ray material, ultimately you're probably planning on rendering this in either Arnold or V-Ray. So again, this is a preview based on the Modo renderer. So that's what we're getting here inside of this new Modo render palette. All right, great. So in this video, we've learned how to preview our textures in a rendered format using the Modo renderer. Let's go ahead and move on to the final clip in this particular course and learn how we can get our textures out of Mari.